though the world waited in silence for human hands to name it, measure it, and finally rule it. We open our history books where writing begins, where kings list their victories, where temples rise from dust into certainty. And everything before that becomes a dim hallway we do not walk down for long. Prehistory, before, as if before means nothing, but there is an older question, whispered beneath the confident one. A question that survives in the place's official history, does not love to linger, in myths that refuse to die, in ruins that seem too heavy for the hands we imagine, in maps that look like memories of coastlines no one is supposed to have seen, and in stories, repeated across oceans, that insist we were not first. What if the Earth had rulers long before modern humanity stood upright and called itself the master? Not rulers in the simple sense of crowns and laws, but dominions, presences, beings that shaped the world's early imagination, that taught, demanded, watched, or fought. The idea is not new, it is ancient, and perhaps that is why it feels dangerous, because it does not begin in laboratories or in modern speculation, but in the oldest language we have, legend. According to legend, the world was once shared with those who were not us. Some traditions describe ages when the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural were thin, when the land itself answered to names we no longer know. Others speak of a sequence of eras, as if the planet had seasons of rulers, one kind giving way to another, like stone giving way to trees, and trees giving way to animals, and animals giving way to humans. We should be careful, myth is not a courtroom transcript. It is not evidence in the modern sense. Yet myth is also not random, it is patterned, it is persistent. And when unrelated civilizations carry similar stories across vast distances and long centuries, it becomes harder to dismiss the echoes as mere coincidence. In the ancient Near East, there are tales of divine councils and pre-human kingship, lists of rulers who reigned for impossibly long spans before a great flood reset the world. In Greek tradition, there are titans, older powers who ruled before the Olympian order, giants of force and appetite, beings whose downfall reshaped the heavens. In the Hebrew imagination, there are watchers, a shattered concept of beings who look down, who cross boundaries, who leave consequences behind. In India's immense cosmology, there are yugas and cycles, ages of rising and decline, and beings who walk the thresholds between worlds. In Mesoamerican stories, humanity itself is not a single creation, but a series of attempts, eras, people made and remade. In the Nordic cold, there are frost giants and primal beings at the beginning of time, the world built from the body of something older. Across Africa, Australia, the islands, the Americas, there are creator ancestors, culture bringers, tricksters, and first rulers who are not human in any ordinary sense. And in the space between God and monster, between ancestor and enemy, we find a recurring theme. Before humans became the main characters, there were others. They ruled, they built. They taught, they hunted, they demanded tribute. They kept laws the way storms keep laws, the way oceans keep laws, impersonal, immense, and final. The similarities matter. Not because we must take them literally, but because they suggest common human experiences, encounters with something felt as higher, older, and stronger. Perhaps those encounters were with nature itself, earthquakes, volcanic fire, the terrifying authority of drought and flood. Perhaps they were with other human groups remembered as strange. Or perhaps, if these stories reflect distorted memory, they preserve the silhouette of beings who belong to a different chapter of this world. One of the most enduring silhouettes is the giant. Giants walk through mythology like mountains that learn to move. In the Bible's scattered lines, in Greek epics, in Norse sagas, and Celtic tales, in the folklore of the Americas and the Pacific, the giant appears again and again, oversized beings of strength and long life, sometimes wise, sometimes brutal, sometimes both. They throw stones that become hills. They carve valleys with their footsteps. They build walls that no ordinary army could lift. Their bones become landscape, their fights become storms. Some traditions describe them as the children of gods, or as the older inhabitants of the land, displaced by later peoples. Some speak of giant kings, whose reigns are remembered not by laws but by the scars left on the earth. Others describe them as beings who taught early humans, or who demanded service, or who took what they wanted. And then there are the stranger rumors that cling to the edges of this theme like burrs, tales of massive skeletons found and hidden, oversized weapons unearthed and quietly removed, footprints embedded in stone. Most of these stories cannot be verified. Some are hoaxes, some are misinterpretations. Some are folklore growing new branches, yet the persistence of the claim itself is part of the atmosphere. People want giants to have been real, not only because the idea is thrilling, but because it would explain something they feel when standing before certain ruins, the sense that these places were made for bodies unlike our own. Here we reach a second category of evidence, not proof, but provocation: the strange proportions of ancient architecture. Across the world, there are structures that do not behave like ordinary human construction, at least not at first glance. Stone blocks that seem absurdly large, doors and gateways that dwarf a person, not merely in grandeur, but in scale that feels like a different standard. Staircases whose steps do not fit the comfortable rhythm of a human leg. Ceilings that soar into emptiness where no practical need seems to demand it. Platforms that look less like living spaces and more like foundations for something heavier. Of course, humans build big for many reasons: to impress, to honor gods, to display power, to last. Monumentality is a human language, but there are moments when the scale feels not just symbolic, but oddly specific, like a building tailored for someone else's presence. Consider the megalithic walls where stones fit together with a precision that seems to mock the simple tools we imagine. Consider temples whose blocks weigh more than modern cranes prefer to lift. Consider cyclopean masonry, so named because later people believed only one-eyed giants could have stacked such stones. Consider passages and chambers that feel like they were designed for processions, for rituals, for something moving through something larger than a single human body. The official explanations are often strong. Labor forces can be enormous. Engineering can be ingenious. Time can be a tool. Stone can be moved with leverage, sledges, rollers, ramps, and patience. Yet the questions remain because the structures remain, and they stand in silence like witnesses who will not testify, forcing us to argue over their meaning. If ancient builders were fully human, why choose such scale in places where smaller would have sufficed? Why carve and haul with such excess? Perhaps the excess was the point, the architecture as a message to the sky, a declaration of permanence against a fragile life. Or perhaps the excess served ritual needs we no longer understand. Or perhaps the builders inherited foundations from earlier hands and built on top of older platforms the way civilizations often do, layer upon layer, forgetting who poured the first stone. And that possibility opens a door we do not like to walk through, that some ruins are not the start of the story, but the middle. That what we see as origins might be renovations. Now consider another category of unsettling echoes: ancient maps and lost knowledge. There are old charts, copied and recopied, that seem to show coastlines with eerie confidence. Maps that depict lands before official discovery, as if knowledge traveled in ways we do not fully account for. Maps that hint at southern continents, ice-free outlines, or global perspectives that feel ahead of their time. Some of these maps can be explained by later interpolation, creative reconstruction, or misunderstood symbols. Some are the result of extraordinary navigation and long-forgotten maritime traditions. But the fascination persists because the idea is intoxicating that someone once saw the world whole, and then the knowledge was scattered like ash. If we imagine a forgotten era of world rulers, maps become more than tools, they become relics. Not necessarily drawn by non-human hands, but perhaps inherited from a time when the sea was crossed more freely, when trade and travel existed beyond what official timelines allow, or when knowledge belonged to a class of guardians, priests, scholars, navigators who preserved it like fire. There is a reason so many traditions speak of lost libraries, sunken cities, and knowledge stolen by catastrophe. It is not only because humans fear forgetting, but because humans have repeatedly experienced it. Empires collapse, writing is lost, languages die. The sea takes ports, the desert takes farms. A single generation can forget what took 1,000 years to build. So when an old map seems to know too much, it becomes easy to imagine an older intelligence behind it, an ancient order that mapped coastlines not for curiosity, but for control. This brings us to the heart of the idea, the concept of world rulers, not gods in the purely religious sense. Not necessarily immortal beings floating above reality, but dominant presences advanced, powerful, long-lived, or simply older than the human story, caretakers, tyrants, observers. Perhaps they were flesh and bone, perhaps something stranger in the categories of myth, semi-divine kings, giants, serpent beings, shining teachers, underworld judges. The names differ, but the roles often rhyme. Some traditions describe rulers who come from the sky, not in machines, but in metaphor descending as lightning, arriving on clouds, walking in brightness. Others place them beneath the earth, in caverns and deep realms, emerging to instruct or to claim what they consider theirs. Some paint them as culture bringers teaching agriculture, law, writing, astronomy, medicine. Others paint them as predators, taking tribute, demanding sacrifice, enforcing taboo. Many do both because power often does both, it gives and it takes. If these stories reflect distorted memory, what might they remember? One possibility is that world rulers were simply human elites whose authority became mythic over time. Kings become demigods, priests become sorcerers. Conquerors become giants in the imagination of those they conquered. Another possibility is that the stories preserve encounters with other hominin species, now extinct beings like us, but not us, remembered as otherworldly. Another is that the rulers were personifications of natural forces, the ocean as a king, the volcano as a tyrant, the flood as a judgment. Myth has always been a way to negotiate with what cannot be negotiated with. And yet, there is a lingering unease that these explanations do not fully dissolve. Because myth does not merely say, the storm is angry, it says, there was a time when someone ruled here, and they are gone, gone. Why are they gone? Nearly every culture holds a memory of rupture, a fall, a flood, a war in heaven, a fire from above, a great darkness, an age of ice, a shattering of the old order. Sometimes it is moral, the rulers fall because of pride, violence, forbidden acts. Sometimes it is cosmic, the world turns and an age ends. Sometimes it is violent, gods fight gods, giants fight gods, old kings fight new kings, and the earth becomes collateral. Flood myths are especially widespread, from Mesopotamia to the Americas, from Asia to the Pacific. There are stories of waters rising to erase what came before. These could be memories of local disasters, river floods, tsunamis, sea level rises after ice ages. They could be metaphors for civilizational collapse. But they also function as narrative resets, the wiping away of an older dominion. Some legends speak of celestial disasters, stars falling, fire raining, the sun changing its path. There are myths of the sky splitting, of a dragon swallowing light, of a great winter that lasts too long. In a mythic lens, cosmic events are not weather. They are political, the heavens are not indifferent. They are a battlefield. Imagine for a moment a world that truly had ancient rulers, whether giants, semi-divine kings, or other beings we cannot easily name. If their era ended, how would it end? Perhaps not with a clean handover, but with catastrophe. Perhaps the planet itself rebelled. Perhaps the old rulers fought among themselves and broke the balance. Perhaps a flood came and their city sank into mud and sea. Perhaps the climate shifted and their dominion withered. Perhaps their knowledge was preserved by a few and then mythologized as sacred teaching. In many stories, after the fall comes inheritance. Humanity survives in the margins, in caves, on high ground, on boats, in hidden valleys. The old masters disappear, and the world becomes quieter, emptier, but also freer. And then humans do what humans always do: rebuild, rename, and eventually forget the true shape of what came before. But forgetting is never complete. It leaves fingerprints. Why do the stories remain? Because myth is not only invention. It is memory wearing a mask, or at least it can be. In the same way a dream can blend real events with impossible imagery, a myth can preserve a historical core beneath symbolic layers. A flood becomes a moral judgment, a conquering people becomes a race of giants. An astronomer becomes a star-born teacher. A lost civilization becomes a golden age ruled by gods. The truth is not erased, it is translated into the language of awe. There is also a psychological truth. Humans are haunted by the suspicion that we did not begin the world, we only arrived in it. That we live among ruins not only of stone but of time. That the land has older owners, even if they no longer claim it. So myths become a kind of inheritance document, passed down orally when libraries burn and empires fall. They compress knowledge into story because story can survive what paper cannot. A child can memorize a myth, a village can carry it through famine. A wandering people can keep it through exile. Even when the meaning fades, the structure remains like a melody whose words are forgotten, still recognizable centuries later. And this is where the idea becomes most haunting, because it does not require certainty. It requires only the admission that the past is layered. We stand before a megalith and feel small. We read of ancient kings reigning for tens of thousands of years and laugh, but the laughter catches because we cannot fully explain why such numbers were chosen. We see a map that seems to know too much and tell ourselves it must be a mistake, but we keep looking at it anyway. We hear of giants and dismiss it as folklore, but we also notice how often the folklore points towards certain places, mountains, caves, old walls, like it is trying to guide our attention. What if these are not proofs, but fragments? What if the world is like a shattered tablet, and each culture holds a piece too small to translate alone, but enough to show that the tablet once existed? According to legend, there were rulers who were not human, or not fully human, whose time ended. Some traditions describe them as watchers, beings who observe the rise and fall of ages, intervening only when balance breaks. Some describe them as ancient kings who taught early humanity the first arts, how to plant, how to build, how to measure the heavens. Some describe them as tyrants who demanded blood and labor, and whose fall was a liberation. In some stories, they retreat into hidden places, beneath mountains, across the sea, into the sky, into realms that overlap ours but do not fully touch it anymore. And if these stories reflect distorted memory, then perhaps what remains is not a photograph of the past, but an atmosphere, a sense that our dominance is recent and therefore fragile. Because ruled might not mean what we think it means. Perhaps Earth was once ruled not by a single empire, but by a different relationship between beings and environment. A time when the boundary between human and other was not yet defined. A time when intelligence took forms we would not recognize. A time when the sacred and the political were the same thing, because survival required obedience to forces that felt like persons. Or perhaps the rulers were simply the earth itself, its ice, its fire, its floods, and we personified them as kings because the human mind seeks faces and power. The world rulers were then not creatures, but conditions. Glacial ages that commanded migrations, megafauna that dominated landscapes, oceans that claimed coastlines and reshaped the map. In that sense, before humans, the earth truly was ruled by others, by creatures larger than any living today, by predators that did not fear us, by ecosystems that had never heard our names. Yet the myths insist on more than ecology. They insist on intention, on teaching, on law, on warfare, on the drama of succession. That insistence is the spark that keeps this question alive. So we end where we began, at the edge of the throne.